Welcome to the Faith Science Podcast, episode 25. I'm your host, Jerry Swafford, and on this podcast, we explore the integration of science with faith. Today's guest spent 34 years as a child welfare social worker. He's written 2 books about his work as a social worker and also a book about the solutions to many of the ills facing our society. His newest book is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. A court investigator examines the Gospels. We're going to discuss his history and the new book as well. Today's guest is Lance Hillsinger. Lance, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you on today. So, you are retired from the social work stuff,
Yes, I
or are you
retired on
still?
my 60th birthday. I was fortunate to do that. Yes.
Oh, okay. So, is that what you originally started out wanting to do your entire life, or how did you get into social work?
There's a good story, but let me back up about how what I wanted to do is I wanted to be a diplomat.
Okay.
Um, I, and I took the civil service exam for that as a very challenging exam. And I didn't pass. You have to pass various subsections, and I didn't pass the English one. And now I'm writing books, so I kind of like figure like there you are, State Department.
Right.
But the story of how I became a social worker, I think is interesting. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology and political science from UCLA, and then direct from UCLA, I went to Vanderbilt and got a master's. I was originally on an academic track, and that kind of thing, and I realized that was not for me. And so I returned back to California. I got a job working with dual diagnosis, people who were developmentally delayed and had a mental illness, a very challenging population. And we worked in pairs, and I was sort of the senior person, and um, then I had a junior partner. Neither one of us were paid very much. The junior partner was paid not much more than minimum wage, and we worked with a group of guys, mostly young adults, and I just didn't click. The turnover in the junior partner was very, very frequent. So one time I got paired with somebody who I just, to be honest, I didn't get along with. I just didn't. I didn't click with. One day she suggested, let's take Dale and see if we can get him a job as a dishwasher in a county cafeteria. And I said, and I realized, oh, that's a good idea. I said, we had clashed so much of my initial opposition was to say no, but it was a good idea. This was in the pre-internet days. We go down to the Hall of Administration, and there's this huge book that has every job that LA County offers, from accountant to zookeeper. And as we're going through this huge book of jobs, I hit children's services worker before we hit dishwasher, and that's how I wound up getting into be the, in child welfare.
Okay. So with child welfare, you then stayed on though, so it seems to be something that either you took to or that you found I guess a great deal of purpose in that.
Yes, as I write in the book, after about 2 months of the job, I said, yes, this is where I belong. This is really where I feel right with the right world. Um, you've run into a lot of sad situations. You have to exercise judgment. There's a lot of chaos in the system. The system was changing quite a bit at that time. Um, and so, yeah, I felt good. It had the right mix of what I consider my skills to what the job needed. It was the right mix. So I enjoyed it greatly. The first year I did emergency investigations. So someone calls the hotline, you go out and do an initial investigation. Most of the time, that does not result in the child being removed from the home. But when it does trigger a court case. So for the rest of my career, I handled court cases of one type or another. I didn't particularly like being an emergency response worker. I liked handling the court work. So that was very, very, very rewarding for me.
So in the court work, basically you receive a case and then you need to gather the information that the court needs, and then I guess they would put you on the stand to talk about different cases. Is that how it works?
Well, like I said, when a call comes in the hotline, less than 1 in 1,000 of those calls result in a termination of parental rights. So I just want to let people know out there. But see, this, oh, you're out to kids. No, most of the time, kids remain in the home. And if they don't remain in the home, they're more often than not placed with a relative.
Mhm.
But when either the police or one of my coworkers would pull a kid in protective custody, take a kid into a foster home immediately, then you have to file a petition within 48 hours to say, Judge, these are the reasons why. Um, Under the code, we think this child needs protection in the juvenile court. And then what we call California detention report. In other states, they call it an affidavit. Or a declaration that says these are the detail reasons. So you have one document that says in legal language, this is what happened in a few paragraphs, and then you have more details. And so getting those reports out was challenging because you only have so many days to, so you have to file a petition and you have to get the report basically within 72 working hours. And that can be challenging sometimes. And then you have another hearing after that called the jurisdiction hearing that says, do we have facts? Does the what you alleged at the beginning, is this true? What more documentation you have? Police reports, medical reports, psychological reports. And then you have a dispositional. So, okay, we have this information. What are we going to do? Now, very often those two hearings are combined. And then after that, assuming there's a jurisdiction and the child remains a dependent, you could dismiss the case anyway along the line, or the abuse could occur in the mother's home when you place the kid with the father if he's a non-offending father, and you can just dismiss the case right there. After taking jurisdiction, then you can make new custody orders. But then once the child's declared dependent court, then you review hearings every 6 months, at least every 6 months. And then generally there's some exceptions. Parents get 18 months from the time the child entered foster care to get the child back. And then you have what we call a permanency planning hearing. So for roughly 2/3 of my court career, I handle the cases up to disposition. Then very typically there's a new social worker from disposition for the other cases. And that's what I handled the rest for roughly a third. So very rewarding. I also got to work with what we call non-minor dependents, kids who were in foster care. When they turned 18, the system used to just shake your hand and good luck, kid, and now they can be if they meet certain conditions like going to school or working, they can remain a dependent of the court till they're 21. So
Okay,
that was
so
very
like
rewarding.
what happens in that case? So if a kid is 19, what exactly are you doing with these you said they're non-minor cases, I
Dependents,
guess. Dependents.
non-minor
So
dependents. Um, well, we're helping them keep in school. We're encouraging them. Um, they will get a subsidy to help pay for their expenses. And basically trying to transition them to full adult life. Some of the conditions is that there's classes that teaches them, you know, how to manage a household, how to balance a checkbook, or finances, and that kind of thing. Some kids were interested in these programs, some were not, um, and most of them were actually pretty responsible with the money. And
okay. So a lot of times people look at these kinds of systems where, again, you mentioned kind of people have this sense that CPS is taking children away from their parents that should be in their home and that kind of thing. Uh,
right.
do you overall view the system as being pretty good, or what would you say about kind of what the perception is versus the reality? And then what are things maybe you would say how we really should be changing this or doing this differently?
I talk a lot about in my first book, In Place of the Parents Inside Child Protective Services, about the good and parts of the system. And one of the things of social workers we're sort of saying, if something's working in a family, you kind of recognize that. That's kind of a mantra, you know. Um, and so there are things that good, and there's the balance between the state's right, the state's interest in protecting children, and the parent rights to raising their children. But it sounds more complicated than it is because roughly 2/3 of our cases was neglect due to drug abuse.
Mhm.
And so those are relatively straightforward. Um, and the question is how much sobriety does a parent need to demonstrate before they get the child back? That's really the more challenging thing.
Oh,
Um, and as far as you talked about testifying, I once estimated that I testified maybe in my career just 75 times. Most cases resolve either just I've had cases where okay, everybody agrees with the report, or there's little minor changes, or then we have mediation, and sometimes usually that's successful too. So relatively few trials. There are some, and 1 hour on the stand can feel like all day. I could tell you, but
yeah.
and one of the reasons I wrote the current book we're talking about
Hmm.
is very few of the families that come in the court system had any connection to organized religion. that faith, I just, whenever they had some sort of interest in faith, I would try to encourage it. I kind of limited as a civil servant. But I would tell people, look, if you take 10,000 people at random who go to bars and 10,000 people who go to church every Sunday, who do you think what kind of, play the percentages, you know? You won't find every good person, you find good people in both groups. Where are you going to find more good people, more
Right.
supportive people? And that's what I try to sell people. So, and that's one of the things I talk about. It's more of philosophy, is that some people are turned off by the hard sell of religion. Sometimes it comes off so hard, you must believe, and that turns people off. And I wanted kind of more of the soft sell. Hey, look, let's see, do you see your life 5 years from now? Are you going to be happier? And people who've gone to AA, belief in tenet of AA is a belief in a higher power. That's helped many people recover, and we have to recognize this. Um, so we can't be so jaded about religion as so many people are these days.
So is that so? I'm in the South, so I'm in like Alabama. So there is compared to California, I guess you were in, so I'm from Nashville. You were in Vanderbilt. So you
Right?
were.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
curious as uh, to what when you were at Vanderbilt, did you see a difference maybe between what you were used to in California and what you saw in Tennessee in terms of being receptive to religion in general, or was it you were basically in academia, so it might have not
I
been the
was in
same?
graduate school. I didn't get much involved with the community, and so
Oh,
no,
okay,
it didn't
yeah, yeah.
really.
So I worship with some people that are from California, and that talked about some of the hostility that they sometimes came across for being people of faith there. So I don't know what it is. In your case, you said you're limited in terms of you can't really, as a social worker, ever say something like, "Well, come to church with me" or something like that.
Right, right.
Where
You
you
can't do
are,
that. You can't.
right,
You're a
right.
civil servant. You can't use that. You can't advocate religion.
Yes, but
So I
what you
so I
said, you
would use the,
go
play
ahead.
the percentages kind of thing, and hopefully that's something that got through. And I thought that was acceptable, and nobody ever called me on it. So I guess it is.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so with the new book, it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. A court investigator examines the Gospels. So you said this was something where you were really trying to make the case for the gospel accounts uh, being something that a person can reasonably believe in. Would that be
Well,
accurate?
I go through what are spiritual truths and literal truths.
Mhm.
The story of Adam and Eve, even the Catholic Church acknowledges that that's allegorical. That's a spiritual truth. That's not a literal truth in their mind. And so if you accept that their Genesis is spiritual truth, then perhaps there are places in the Gospels that are also spiritual truths, just as valid. But if you dogmatically say they must be literal truth or you're not a good Christian, that's going to turn people off to faith, or some people.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine that would be the case. So in that case, you're because I just finished the book this morning. I haven't had
Oh,
a lot
good.
of time to digest it, but it seems that in the book, you are making the case that there is a great deal of spiritual truth, allegorical truth that you would say are in the gospel accounts, but that but not necessarily literal truth. And I guess I come across that sometimes when I'm talking to atheists on the in the comments for the channel and that kind of thing. That I think they would be willing to concede often allegorical or symbolic truth, but when it comes to like the literal resurrection of Jesus from the dead, for example, they would say, well, no, that's not something that we can go along with. What I you went into the resurrection, you went into the well, even the death of Jesus in various sections of the Gospels. Can you talk about how are you determining what parts you would say are literal and what parts you would say are not?
Well, let me give you maybe not so much with the resurrection because that's a very complicated. There's a lot of details. Let me give you an example that's more straightforward that tells you kind of the philosophy. I looked, and I confess I don't remember which gospel is in, but they say that Jesus was dressed in a purple robe. Well, then I
Mhm.
ask the obvious question: the soldiers dressed in a purple robe. Where did the purple robe come from? That's what an investigator would ask.
Mhm.
So the soldiers didn't have a purple robe laying about. That would be ridiculous. They didn't have that. Purple was very expensive. That was the dye. The dye for purple. I once saw something about the manufacturer. It's very labor intensive, and so it was very expensive dye. Pontius Pilate probably even did. Now, when he was a member of the equestrian class, which was much poorer than the senatorial class, did King Herod have it? Maybe. Did a soldier run back and, hey, King Herod, can we borrow a robe to tease Jesus with? That probably didn't happen. So that the purple robe is probably an allegorical truth. And that doesn't diminish it in my mind and enriches it by saying that this is an allegorical truth, spiritual truth, that to some people that this, okay, I can believe that as a symbol. And so that's what I come back. And no one's right or wrong here. If you believe it as a literal truth and that makes you a better person, fine. That's great. That's what I want. That's the thing to do is I want people to get a connection to faith so that they will be kinder to their neighbor, nicer people, you know, the kind of person you would like as your neighbor.
So
And
I guess what I'm curious about is if the person who is going to the scripture for uh, to get that the spiritual truth, if it's actually if it is untrue that there was a real purple robe, um, I'm curious, what doesn't that seem to take away from the Bible if it's not actually true, if it's just kind of a fabricated story?
I don't think so. I think for some people, yes, I could see some people saying that, well, if it's a fabrication, um, yeah, no, that diminishes it. So I can see people seeing it. I can see that as a logical thing. Other people saying, since it's so improbable that soldiers would have a purple robe, if I take it as a spiritual truth, it is easy for me to believe. So
Hmm.
you can flip it the other way and say, since it's so improbable, this thing, because there's no supernatural, there's no divine, these are soldiers. How are these soldiers getting this? You know? And if you accept that it's a spiritual truth, then you can believe it more easily. If you say, oh, it has to be a literal robe, um, then people say, I'm turned off the Bible. I'm gonna watch something on Netflix or something else.
Okay, so like
I'm
watch
turned off. If
some.
you say I must believe it as a literal truth, people may not keep reading.
Oh, so I guess so you're so base it would be based on plausibility then, I guess, is
Yeah,
where
yeah,
we're saying
plausibility.
if I don't think it's plausible, then then it's not literal. And I guess that because then that does raise questions of things like the resurrection of Christ, because that's way less plausible than the existence of a purple robe that the soldiers
Right,
could have
right.
scrounged up. So it's difficult. I guess my question becomes, where do you how do you know how do you come to determine what's literal and what's not based on plausibility, because it's plausibility is different for
Well,
different
I
people.
think I don't dismiss that some things can be, for lack of a better word, supernatural. Okay, I talk a little bit about, as you read in the book, about miracles.
Hmm.
Obviously, there are times that there have been miracles have happened. People have had spontaneous remissions and health, and so there was something there. And there's times that I have felt the presence of God. I'm not denying that you cannot, say logically say, oh, why do I suddenly feel this way? For this oneness with the universe or whatever. So there's a point where, yes, logic and, breaks down. And you do have to, at one point, have a leap of faith. What I'm saying is that where you get the leap of faith along the way is individual to you. You don't have to take Adam and Eve as a literal story, but if it leads you to a wonderment, okay, we're all one people, fine. If you want it as a literal story, fine. whichever way path that leads you to faith, to be a better person, to be more loving to your fellow human being, to be more considerate, to be that. That's great. And I think that you're right. I have a friend of mine who's a nice guy, but he's an atheist, and I think that he misses out a little bit on life. He doesn't have those spiritual moments. Um, and I think that you know that's what I want, is to bring people to faith so that they have that with them to help go through the challenges of life. We all have challenges. There's a lot of people in this world that the only time they are inside a church is for a wedding or a funeral.
Mhm.
And I'm at the age where I've been to a few funerals, and the ones that have been in a funeral home, not in a church, I just don't quite have the same emotional moment, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think that those people who their faith is sort of a side thing, or, something they don't approach, they miss something out of life. And that's where I wanted to reach those people to say, hey, you can, um, forget what somebody's dogma is trying to do. How do you want to come to faith? What's plausible to you? Um, if you believe in this, if you believe in the resurrection, and that's that, or are you acting as Jesus would? Like, let's say a person has a moral dilemma, and they reach this moral dilemma as Jesus would. That's where we show our Christianity, broadly speaking. So a person who is Jewish who says, "Oh, I was tempted by this situation, but I went this way that Jesus would have even if he was here," that's what I believe, because one of the things I point out is what about intelligent people? I'm of the generation. I grew up with Apollo. I grew up with Star Trek. I grew up with Carl Sagan talking about billions and billions of stars. They're pretty lucky that we have there's intelligent life somewhere else in the cosmos. Well, does God dismiss those people? Or do we say there's Jesus on 2 planets or 10,000 planets? So if you recognize that, if you believe a benevolent God wouldn't dismiss people who don't live, who are not earthly Christians, that somehow salvation, heaven, whatever, can come for those people on some other intelligent planet, intelligent people in some other world, then you have a broader understanding of what faith is, and then um, you can get closer in your Christianity. For some people, other people, they like that solid rock. Um, my my daughters were involved in Rainbow Girls, which is the teen version of teen girl group for the Masons, not Mormon Masons, and they go to a church once Easter. Most of the time, their organization is just like any other teen group. They have their activities and everything. But the Sunday before Easter Sunday, they go to a church, and we went with them. And one was a very fundamentalist teacher, when one was more closer to mine than one other year. The ones that were more literals, I didn't feel anything, and but it didn't speak to me. The literalism doesn't speak to some people. Um, and but yet we don't want to dismiss them out of faith, and so that's what I didn't do anything for my kids. If anything, it made them less religious, because they came with somebody who was kind of fire from the fire and brimstone kind of background. Some of the
Uh-huh.
people were very happy with it. Oh, wasn't that sermon lovely? And my girls were trying to be polite, and they were not impressed. They were not, and neither was my wife and I. But I see that those people were happy. I just want to add, like, and I don't want anybody to think that I'm anti-religion or anti-Christian. I had the opportunity to be at St. Patrick's Cathedral about a little over a month ago in New York, and I saw people praying. There, that doesn't the all the murals and stained glass world are beautiful. I could appreciate for artistic reasons, but it wasn't as spiritual to me. It didn't speak to me spiritually. I could appreciate it as art. But I could see that other people were feeling in the moment. They were feeling the moment with God. They were feeling something, some comfort. And so I don't want to no one wants to take that from them. So That's one of the things. There are many, as my aunt used to say, it's all ice cream. It's just different flavors.
Okay. So in that case, so like with your friend the atheist, do you find that uh not you mentioned kind of there's this view of the scripture as being this solid rock that you can kind of base everything on. Um what do you what does your atheist friend think about that? Or maybe you all haven't really talked about it. I'm curious what what is his view of the Bible?
I don't know. We just haven't talked about it because it's just something that I know his views about, and I don't want to lose him as a friend by trying to, hey, Steele, what do you think of the gospel? What do you think of? I don't want to ruin the friendship. That he knows that we're affiliated with the church. He knows I'm a little more spiritual than he is, and I do think he's a little jaded with life, but he's also can be a very positive person. And I think so many people now are jaded, and faith takes away that jadedness. And that's one of the things that I want to speak to is that there's hope for a better future. There's hope for a better future on earth and heaven, and um, that's what the book was about, and a path that some people might find attractive. I know that more of the literalists are going to find it unattractive, and all I ask is that you don't pan the book
Yeah,
because
so so
because go
yeah, go
ahead.
ahead. Well, so yeah, I view the book the Bible literally. Um so I'm curious about alternate views of it and it seems to me that part of the viewing it literally is that I trust what it says, and the thing that I struggle with is if I'm allowed to, let's say, take something like the purple robe and make and decide that because it's improbable, then what was said didn't happen. It's I'm not sure how I can't also do that with spiritual truths that are in it as well. So can you kind of talk about that, for like what your approach is there? Because if Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, and I go, well, that's not really, that's improbable to me, or that's implausible to me. It seems that I can then make the scripture do or say whatever I want it to, and it seems that again takes me to a place where if there's something that's truly real about the world spiritually, if I can't really know because I'm always putting everything through the lens of what I think is plausible or not. So I guess what I'm saying is there are plenty of things that you were saying in the book where there was a spiritual or symbolic truth that you took out of the gospel account, but you were saying, but I don't think that actually happened, and it seems that then you can make all of the gospels say things completely different than what it's was written. It would seem, and I'm not trying to I'm trying to just like I said, I haven't had a lot of time to digest it, but that's what it seemed, and I'm curious how you can how you do that and how that gives you comfort, I guess, because it seems that for me it would make everything drift.
I can see your point. How if you have a consistent thing and you believe this, and there's comfort in that the things, and you can have a little cognitive what we call cognitive dissonance. How can I believe a gospel if the gospel is inaccurate?
Right.
Um, One of the things is the gospel is, as pointed out in the book, is the written word from an oral tradition.
Mhm.
And biblical scholars say, well, how accurate was that oral tradition? And a lot of people are very skeptical of that. How could you pass that down? And as I point out in the book, is most of us learned the Pledge of Allegiance when we were kids, but we probably never had to write it down, and yet we could recite it today. So there's a plausibility of oral tradition being fairly accurate, particularly with the parables, because they are easier to remember. You have a way of remembering it, so it's easier for those parables to be uh, accurately transcribed, down the road. Um, how you pick and choose, I guess it's a matter of faith. If something seems to you as so implausible, how can you go, that would be the attitude of it. But if you say, oh, okay, um, the idea of Jesus being born into a poverty, that we don't, that he was not a son of a prince or something, that he was not an exalted birth, in the sense that, okay, that means I have a God for everyone. Do we have to literally say that Mary and Joseph traveled 75 miles to be taxed? That's probably not plausible. There's no record of this kind of mass thing, and it wouldn't make sense to conduct a census if everybody had to go to their hometown. But it does say, look, we have a humble beginning here. And one of the things that surprises me is that Mary and Joseph went to a home, um, and said, and this is a distinction between the King James version where it says no room at the inn. Well,
Mhm.
Bethlehem didn't have any Motel Sixes. Let's be frank about that. They didn't have a Motel Six.
Right.
Um, but in the New International Versions, it's guest room, so which that implies somebody's home. Okay, there was no room at somebody's home. Well, wouldn't common decency say, "Hey, you're pregnant. Why don't you come inside and I'll sleep outside?" You know. Um, but if presumably this person who had the guest room or didn't have the guest room was Jewish, they want to keep their home kosher, they want to keep their home clean. That's kind of the language there. They would want somebody with this fantastic story coming into their house, And so I say, okay, let's just suppose this relative is an uncle. Maybe the uncle should say, okay, you go sleep in the barn. I don't want to bring your untruths into my kosher home. And if they are sleeping in a barn, maybe there is a little literal truth that Jesus was born, kept in a manger, and a manger and cradle are not synonymous as most people would think.
Mhm.
A manger was a trough, a watering trough for animals. It wasn't a cradle that Joseph made. Oh, Mary, well, I better make you a cradle. It's coming up. Uh, no. Um, so,
Yeah. Yeah. So
so
it's, yeah. So I guess that's the thing. I think like one of the things that you're able to do really well in the book is you're able to kind of come up with these scenarios of how it might have happened in this way that wasn't the literal. And it seems that you could, like you just did in that case, like you were really easily able to kind of craft a sense of how it could have actually been literal too. So I guess that that ability to imagine both, it kind of depends on what your perspective is, that you can just as easily imagine how it could be literal as how it might not be. So
as far as a sense that I took, sometimes when I would write court reports, I would think, okay, this is what's going on in the case, and this is what I would think in my head. And then as I was gathering facts, kind of putting it, okay, and I was like, no, it's not quite this. Sometimes good court reports would tend to write themselves. They would say,
mhm.
okay, this happened this happened this time, and here's a connection that is not necessarily obvious at first. Um, and that's the thing that I found looking at this. I'm not. You probably can cite the Bible chapter and verse much better than I can, but I looked at it with the fresh eyes of, okay, how would I look at this as an investigator? If this was evidence, this person says that person says this. How can we? What is plausible here that gives us a truth, that people can say, okay, I can believe in that. I can't believe in uh, Earth is only 4,000 years old. That what they used to say and that kind of thing.
Okay, so it sounds like again you're wanting to make it winsome for or ec- more palatable for people who are not believers is kind of the approach there. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a soft sell. It's a soft
Okay.
sell, and it's like, okay, hey, you're right. Oh, I learned something. Like the Sea of Galilee. It's not, the sea is really a lake because it's inland, it's fresh water. How big is it? How plausible is the storms? And one of the things that I thought was really interesting was, okay, I want meteorological data for that part of the world. And I was surprised that where I found it was U.S. Missile Command. That was kind of scary. I thought that's where my citation for meteorological data was popped up from.
Huh.
Um, that was an eye opener for me. But that's kind of what an investigator does. You ask a question, okay, what was what was weather like typically at that part of the world. And then so I looked, and that's how I got that. So this is surprises that surprise I had.
Yeah. So the other thing is that when we're kind of trying to take the gospel accounts and piece them together, I think you did some of this where you were taking the gospel accounts referring to a single instance and kind of taking those the details from each one and using them to complement each other to kind of get a fuller picture of what happened. I assume that you were that's something you had to do all the time because you could have three or four people or who I guess witnesses where you're gathering information and one person is saying this, that person is saying that, and it's not necessarily that people are lying, but you'd have to try to piece together and come up with a sense of what happened when you weren't there. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect of the gospel accounts being complementary of each other and any insights you saw from that?
Well, let's as I talk in the book about, let's say you're right about people not lying. A lot of times in trial, people would outright lie, but really
Mhm.
most of the time it was a more of a question of perspective, and question of, like, if you and three friends go to see a movie and you go tell the story of the movie to another friend who hasn't seen the movie, you're going to have four different versions of the movie.
Right.
That doesn't necessarily mean that anybody's lying. They're different perspectives. One of the things, the stories about washing Jesus's feet. I didn't know that that was a custom, that people washed the feet before they entered the home. That there would have a servant, or the wife in the family would wash the feet if they didn't have a servant. I didn't know. So that gives you a better appreciation for the story of washing the feet. And I pick apart those stories because they look like two separate incidents. And I wouldn't have to go back to exactly read the text. But Jesus says this to one person, and one person was saying it. So there's a little sequence of events there that's contradictory, or there was two incidents. You know, you either say these gospels are contradictory, which just says, oh, okay, the atheists say, okay, well, the contradictory, I can't believe anything that's contradictory. Or you can say, hey, here's the way that we resolve this contradiction. Um, and uh, so
Yeah, I think in
therefore,
that
this is a path
section,
to be.
right. I think that's in that section. One of the things I think you said that traditionally that those were viewed as the same instance, but the more you looked at it, you said, well, this looks like these are two separate instances. And I think that's what I thought the same way. I had not heard of the tradition, whatever the traditional sense was as them being the same thing. I'd never heard of that before. But one of the things you did was just said, okay, I know that traditionally they say these are the same, but when I'm looking at the details, there's enough divergence there that this looks like this is actually two separate things. And once you understand that, it reconciles the gospel accounts. So I thought that was interesting. Um, so, so what do you what when you do you want to do this with more than the gospel accounts? Is there like a part two to this kind of thing in terms of you've kind of done this court investigator approach to the gospels? Do you foresee looking at anything else in scripture and saying, hey, I want to show how yes, these oral traditions could have been recorded and here's the truth of them? And or is that just kind of a one-off? Because if I look at your other three books, they are not really uh the first two are about um your past life in being a court investigator, a social worker. The second one is kind of about the social ills of society, and then the third one is about like Amelia Earhart or after Amelia or
It's
beyond
beyond
Amelia.
Amelia,
Yeah,
lesser known women of yesteryear.
yeah. And so
Uh,
this one is a little bit different. Is this a new direction as an author, or was this a one off? What are you
well,
thinking
originally I
about?
was thinking, oh, okay, I'll try the whole New Testament, and then go, no, that's too ambitious. That's just too ambitious. I'll just
Okay.
stick with the Gospels on this, the court examination of this stuff. Is there going to be a part two? No, I really don't know if there's a fifth book in me. I really don't know what I'm going to do. I'm right now. I've got your podcast and a few others lined up, on
Mhm.
a radio show next week. But I don't know what I'm going to do after that. I enjoy writing. It keeps the brain sharp. It gives me kind of meaning. but what will I do as next? I'm not sure. I may try fiction. I don't know. That fiction, by the way, is far more profitable than nonfiction. It's
All right.
far more lucrative.
Okay.
It's,
All right. So is
this
there
book was never going to be made into a movie, but if you write a fictional book, it might be made into a movie, and that's where there's a lot of money there.
yeah, I don't it's not yeah, it's not really a movie, but yeah, so maybe you could do some fiction. Are there any things that you're working on right now? Is this the main thing that you would say I'm most excited about at the time? Would be
Right,
this
right.
book that's being
Like I said,
released?
I've got a few other podcasts lined up, and yes, that's what I'm excited about. And we got Christmas coming, but what I'm going to do in January, I really don't know. But I have
Okay.
faith it'll all work out.
Yeah. All right. Well, I know you had like two-thirds battery left, so we want to get to the final questions before we get out of here. So the first of the final questions is there a book that you're recommending to people other than the Bible or one of your own?
I'm currently reading. It's very interesting. I'm almost finished with it. It's by Oliver Stone and someone else. It's The Untold History of the United States, and there's a companion book or roughly companion book that's a people's history of the United States. So Oliver Stone's book is very liberal, very progressive, very kind of the U.S. The government is messed up a lot of times. The other book is very patriotic, and we're all great, we're all perfect, and America is a wonderful. So I think what's important is that we read both. And so there's a that I go to the gym, and as I work out, and I they have one screen of Fox and one screen of CNN, and
Uh-huh.
there is two different worlds out there. And I think that we need to be broad-minded. Everyone should be broad-minded and listen to other things. So that's as far as the political sense. I think that's good. They're both books are rather dated, but their take on history is enlightening.
Okay. All right. Is there an interesting quote or scripture you'd like to share?
Yeah, I have it here. I have it in my book. It's an easier reference for me, but it's uh, Ecclesiastics 5:16. Um, when God gives someone wealth and possessions and the ability to enjoy them, to accept their lot and be happy in their toil, this is the gift of God. And I think that that's one of the things that we sometimes people talk about sacrifice and this. God wants us to enjoy life here on this earth. Yes, there's going to be challenges. Yes, but take a, you know, we don't have to deprive ourselves. We can have a good life and still be a good Christian and be nice to our neighbors and pay our taxes and, be a good person, but we can also enjoy life too. There's nothing wrong with on the ball game and having a good time.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. What is a unconventional belief you have? Something you believe that most, if not many people, don't.
I looked at that when you sent an email, and I'm pretty mainstream in most of my beliefs. I can't think of anything offhand that I'm out of limb on, other than this
Uh,
idea that there is a belief in that there's intelligent life out there somewhere in the cosmos, and that God would not dismiss of these people. That somehow that salvation is not reserved for just people on planet Earth.
yeah. So you mentioned that earlier. Is that based on Sagan? Where did that come from? This idea of
That's just a common belief that people my age grew up that we were just there was SETI, there was a search for intelligent life, and we were going to maybe not in our lifetimes, but maybe in our grandchildren's lifetime, we were going to find it. That was just sort of a core belief. I think
huh.
that that's a little still optimistic, but if you look at the billions of galaxies out there, we're not alone in the galaxy. Yeah, most of the other planets, if they have life, they're going to be little microbes, but somewhere out there, there's going to be some intelligent life.
Okay. All right. Last one. Um, you have a piece of wisdom that you'd like to leave behind for your loved ones. If you had a
Well,
single.
to kind of tie in back with Star Trek, there's a great episode where Kirk is believed dead, and Spock and McCoy listen to a recording he has made, and it brings them together. And I saw that as a boy, and I thought, that's what I want to do when I go. I want to leave a message for people. And one of to cut to the chase of that would be to enjoy life. Um, when my father passed away, one of the things I mentioned in the eulogy I gave him was he loved ice cream as dessert. He would have joy in just the simple pleasures of ice cream, even though he'd have it 3, 4 times a week for dessert. he take a joy in it. I think that those we need to do that is take joy in our daily living, because if we do that, it brings other people up. It doesn't have to be, if you're just a happy, good person, people pick up on that, whether you are Christian, where you go on Sunday or not. If you are acting in a way that is good and kind, and people to take joy and enjoy the ball game.
Yeah. Or going back to that previous one. All
Yeah,
right. Well, so the new book is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Court Investigator examines the Gospels. And where can people find that?
it's exclusive on Amazon,
Okay.
and you
So
can
go
get
to
it on
Amazon.
Kindle and paperback and hardbound for under $15. Even the paperback's less than 15.
Okay. All right. So you can find it on Amazon. Um, Anything else you want to say to the audience before we get out of here?
I do have a website that's lancehillsinger.net, and there's more different information about my other books there. There's also a short 42-second video about children in foster care. People could enjoy that and share that, because I think it highlights some of the issues. You know.
And is that kind of suggesting that people think about being foster parents? Is that
No,
kind of
it's
what it
just a book
is?
trailer about my book, honest, but it
Oh,
gives some
okay.
information about it. But it's only 42 seconds long. It doesn't take a lot of time of your life, and that's what you can say in 42 seconds. It's there. So.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank Lance Hillsinger for coming on the show today. Check out the book, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, A Court Investigator Examines the Gospels, on Amazon. That's all for today. We'll see you next week. Until next time, keep asking questions and keep the faith.